from the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.
She was a real, she never stopped talking.
Yeah.
And she,
Okay.
All right, Mrs. Roxbury, Mr. Bond, I'm recording.
Okay.
We begin the interview.
Okay, ready to go?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Ms. Roxborough, you were born into an African American family that was aware of the need to do what was necessary to improve the quality of their daily lives. Can you share with us how your family made changes in their lives to improve their situation?
well, we lived in one of the 3 counties in the state of Tennessee in which blacks did not vote. So one of the things my parents felt, which would be of paramount importance, was to get the right to vote. And they proceeded to campaign for that purpose by getting other people in the community to join them to go to the county courthouse to register to vote. And that was a primary ingredient. And this is before they organized a branch of the NAACP. And of course, they also felt that the community of blacks in the county, Haywood County was the county in which we lived. The county seat was Brownsville, in which I was born. And of course, they felt that it was important to organize our black citizens because they outnumbered the white citizens about 3 to 1, and that if they could marshal the black citizens in greater strength, they could change the quality of our lives to some extent by exercising political power.
Did you ever hear your parents talk about organizing the first NAACP chapter in Brownsville? Did you ever hear them discuss it?
Oh, yes.
What did they have to say?
Well, they said that we needed to have people who would be able to withstand the pressures which they anticipated would be applied when they started formally organizing a group together instead of having individuals who would join them on certain occasions. And in order to do this, at that time, as I recall, Walter White was executive secretary of the NAACP, and I would hear his name frequently saying, "We've got to get Walter White to send us a charter or to authorize a charter for our unit." And then they wrote away to get enough information about the number of people who would be required. And there was much discussion when I was a youngster. I suppose about this time, I was about 7 years of age at that time, having been reading The Crisis because they subscribed to it. So I was well aware of what the NAACP was in my own perspective.
Now, you were 9 years old when you first became involved with the NAACP. What led you to your involvement, and what led you to be willing to sell The Crisis, to sell subscriptions?
Well, both my parents were teachers, and my mother, there were 3 of us, of which I was the youngest. And my mother or my father, virtually every evening before I went to bed, would read poetry and excerpts from history and events to my sisters, and I would be sitting on my mother's lap. And oftentimes, in reading poetry, she would quote to them saying that this is a piece by Langston Hughes, which was published in the Crisis magazine. And of course, I wanted to know what The Crisis was after having heard her say that so often. And she said, "You see it, it's here on the desk or wherever." So I would start looking for The Crisis after hearing my mother mention the fact that they actually were reading excerpts from things that appeared therein. And that's how I learned about The Crisis.
And then how'd you come to sell subscriptions?
Well, I noticed that it was they had in some column, some ad in the paper indicating that subscriptions were available. And I said one day, "Can't I write to Roy Wilkins," who was the editor of the crisis, and ask him if I can't sell the crisis. And said, after all, if you're going to have a chapter of the NAACP, in that then my language wasn't as it is today, as you can appreciate. But they said, by all means, but you must write the letter yourself. I said, I will do that. So I did.
Did he write back?
I got a note from him saying, yeah, we will be glad to have you sell the Crisis magazine. And in any event, it was typed, but it has his signature on it. And under there, it said editor, under his name. And I was so proud to get that letter from the editor of the Crisis, I was beside myself.
I bet. Now, can you share any details with us about what happened to your father as a result of his civil rights activities in 1939?
Oh, well, by 1939, the branch had been organized. He was the president, my mother was secretary. And during those intervening years, my father had been arrested and taken to jail a few times, but not formally charged. He was usually let go. However, one evening, he was brought home having been rather badly beaten, and the two sheriffs, or a sheriff and a deputy, anyway, they were law enforcement officials, brought him home, opened the front door, which wasn't locked, because in those days you didn't lock your door until you went to bed at night, I think. And I was home alone, my mother was at a meeting, and they brought him in and dumped him on the couch, really, and said, take care of your pa, he's been hurt, and if he had not had connections, he would be in jail. So I was, of course, frightened, and I was about 9 at the time. When my mother came home, I said to her, these two men brought him home, and they said to me, if he did not have connections, he would be in jail. I said, what does that mean? And she looked at me and she said, well, I guess I should tell you, the county coroner of Hayward County, his name was John Sevier, was a doctor, and she said, Dr. Sevier probably asked them not to do anything to your father because he's your grandmother's brother. And I said, oh, it was a half-brother, because he was white, and of course my grandmother was black. And he said that, she said that Dr. Sevier is widely respected, and they try to be as accommodating to him as they can.
When you were a student at Howard and later at Washington Square campus of NYU in the 50s, you recall how you and other students felt about segregation and the lack of civil rights that most African Americans endured?
Well, I recall that we went to I think it was the Howard Theater in Washington, because you weren't welcomed in the other theaters as such then, except on a segregated basis. And we were concerned about that. Now, this was during World War II that I was at Howard, and during wartime, we were concerned about, our good and welfare as students, and also why couldn't we go into many of the places which were still segregated in Washington. And there was much discussion about that among us. We probably didn't do very much, but periodically a few of us would undertake to go into a restaurant and be denied entrance, but it never became a big issue in the sense of escalating into arrest at that point in time. That was a little early. This is 1943, and from 43 to 45 I was at Howard. And of course, we all were also concerned about our studies, and there were a lot of uniformed young men, I should say, on the campus as a part of the training program that the federal government had at that point in time.
Now, you joined the NAACP on the staff in 1953, right before the Brown decision, and a little more than a year and a half before Emmett Till was murdered. Share with us the mood of the NAACP staff and leadership, and tell us about some of the personalities you met.
Oh, well, I don't want to give you a wandering answer.
Okay.
I started work in the fall of 1953 to do a special project for Gloucester Current Directive Branches in Baltimore, Maryland, which was one of our largest branches in the country. And it also had as its president a Dr. Lily M. Jackson, who was very well known throughout the country because she was very colorful and very strong and aggressive NAACP leader, and well respected in Baltimore and difficult to please. So I was given, Gloucester Current announced at a staff meeting, he introduced me as a temporary field secretary, that I was going to Baltimore to do a 6-week membership campaign for the Baltimore branch.
Do you have anyone in your family that's difficult to please? Be honest.
Thurgood Marshall, who was sitting a couple of seats away from me, laughed loudly and said, "Gloucester, why are you doing that to that girl? You should be ashamed of yourself." Well, I did not know what that meant until I got to Baltimore and found how demanding and difficult it was to work for Mrs. Jackson. But I did. We had a membership campaign which ran for 6 weeks, and her daughter, Juanita Jackson Mitchell, at that time, was an first organizer of the youth councils, of the youth program for the national NAACP. So she worked with me, and we eventually, we survived each other. I was baptized in that particular branch experience, and worked at that point. There was a man who was the president of Park Sausage, which was an early black corporation, which was, if not the first of its kind, was one of the first of its kind. And one of the great funders was a locally known man, well-known man, who was, his income supposedly was derived from numbers and that type of thing. So I became very friendly with those men and was able to get them to support the NAACP. But those were the extremes. Mrs. Jackson was a great church leader, and these men were on the other side of the spectrum, but they came together for the purpose of supporting this common cause.
Would that have been Henry Parks?
Yes,
Yes.
Henry G. Parks. And the man was William Adams.
Little Willie.
I think they were there. And he was always very nice to me. I always felt very comfortable and safe with him and Henry Parks.
Now,
I was quite young then.
let me take you back to the New York office and the people you met there. Thurgood Marshall, whom you just mentioned a moment ago, obviously you knew of him because you'd been active in the NAACP as a young girl and in later years. What were your impressions of him when you met him?
Oh, well, first of all, I had to get accustomed to his language. I had never heard so many cuss words in my life.
Really?
But which was colorful. Nobody minded, you know, the way he was a wonderful raconteur, and he had a tremendous sense of humor. And I said, "This is Thurgood Marshall?" But he was also very effective in getting you to do things and making difficult subjects sound easy. And he said, "Oh, Hoxie will be going to Hoxie, Arkansas." He said, "You'll be able to do that. It'll be a good first experience for you to get to know the parents there and the children, and it'll be something that you'll remember for years to come." And of course he was right, but it wasn't pie like he had claimed that it would be. But he was good at getting people to do things and also inspiring them. He's an exceptionally bright man, but it was all beneath this demeanor of gruffness and semi-crudeness. It's a manner he affected, and he did well with making you comfortable with him.
And Roy Wilkins, what were your impressions of Roy Wilkins?
Very elegant man, one who was extremely similar to you, concerned about the language and its use and the syntax and sentence structure. And of course, I learned much about grammar and composition from Roy Wilkins, who wrote beautifully. And he also was a very unpretentious person, did not want any ceremony, and he rode the subway, which at that time was 5 cents going and coming to work. He did not want bodyguards or attendants, but he was a purist when it came to commitment to the association. He wanted the staff to dedicate themselves to achieving the goals which were set out for them in terms of their work, and to at all times be properly attired and achieve the right demeanor to present the NAACP as a wholesome, a serious organization who had intelligent people as its representatives.
And Walter White?
Walter White was colorful, and he enjoyed people. He embraced people, and he enjoyed the social interaction, and he also liked the spotlight. Wilkins, on the other hand, did not seek the spotlight. He tolerated it, but Walter White thrived in the spotlight, and he also was, because of his people skill and his ability to interact, he was able to get certain information in terms of doing his research. He was very fair, and he was presumed to be Caucasian unless you would know otherwise. So he was successful in going into places like Mississippi, Georgia, and Arkansas and investigating lynchings and other incidents and coming back without having been assaulted or thrown in jail. So he enjoyed that kind of activity and the fact that he could live in these two worlds, and it was effective.
A moment ago you mentioned Hoxie, Arkansas, and that took you into contact with Daisy Bates. What do you recall about Daisy Bates?
Oh, Mrs. Bates was a very dedicated civil rights worker, but she also had a sense of style, and she enjoyed the spotlight as well. And she was not ever shy. At that time, the governor of Arkansas was Orville Faubus, and he was known to be anti-black, a segregationist, and he was determined to keep the schools in Arkansas separate. And of course, Daisy Bates, on the other hand, this is in the 50s now. This was just before 56. This was 1955, when I first went, 1954, when I first went to Little Rock. And then I went back 2 or 3 years after that, during this period leading up to the integration of Central High. And Daisy was colorful, aggressive, and she didn't mind the spotlight, and very talkative, and she too was a people person. She was able to get branches and what we call the little people and the simple people, many of whom were barely literate, to follow and come into the NAACP, because at this point in time we were focusing on education, to get their students, their children who were students, better education. And she was able to get many of them to become active in the units in the various cities and towns in Arkansas who had never been active before.
And a moment ago, when you and I were talking, we mentioned Rosa Parks. What are your memories of Rosa Parks?
Well, Mrs. Parks was a very charming and gracious lady, and I think I said at one point laconic. She was a few words, but when she spoke, you listened to her, and she was very kind. In those days, when you traveled as a field worker, field secretary, as I was, you would stay in the homes of NAACP people in various parts of the country. Usually they were officers of the branch. And once when I first went to Montgomery, I stayed with Mrs. Parks. This is before, of course, she left Alabama, and she was she and her husband both were very pleasant and comfortable people. They were quietly militant. They weren't bombastic, and they didn't make a lot of noise about it. They just would act, and she would certainly, at that point, she was still secretary of the branch. and she was very determined that we should do more with our youth. So she was focusing at that time a lot in getting the youth in Montgomery to organize and to take certain steps in terms of preparing them to move forward in the integration movement.
And do you remember E.D. Nixon, the president of Montgomery Branch, Pullman car porter?
Yes, I do. I do.
What do you recall of him?
Well, he was a very dedicated person with a strong commitment to civil rights, and he was committed to the NAACP and the way he believed that we had to have an integrated society if we as blacks were to thrive and achieve in this country. And he was one of the few voices who would withstand a lot of the pressure in Alabama to take a stand, and also refused to give up the membership roles of the NAACP in Alabama when the Attorney General demanded it. And that after that period, you may recall that the NAACP was banned from operating in Alabama.
Now, you had been at the NAACP about a year and a half when news comes that this boy, Emmett Till, has been found dead in a river in Mississippi. Do you remember hearing the news about that and what the reaction of the people in the office here was?
Well, yes, I remember. It was considered in our office to be a great tragedy because just before then, and I'm sorry I can't remember the town, one of our branch presidents had been killed in Mississippi.
Gus Counts.
I think, yeah. And we were in the throes of that. And because we had encouraged, the NAACP, were encouraging them to continue the voter education registration campaign. And this brought about his death, the branch president's. And this young child, as he was presumed to be, was killed. It was felt at that point that Mississippi was just completely going out of bounds, and that nothing was sacred or safe in the state, and the NAACP really had to stay behind its people to help them and to keep them from having to cave in or to become too intimidated to keep the movement going, because if the NAACP didn't continue to thrive in NAACP, or function, I should say, not thrive, then we would not be able to do anything about an Emmett Till. And this was the great concern, whether this would stop the movement.
Do you have remembering any interaction with Mamie Bradley, his mother, Emmett Till's mother?
Yes, I arranged a tour, I guess we could, of NAACP branches for Mrs. Bradley to visit, and actually accompanied her for some of the time to some of the cities which we arranged for her to visit. She was a woman who was very articulate, and as she campaigned or visited the units across the country, I should say, she grew more militant and more informed and became more involved. And then, of course, she started speaking more forcefully about and demanding, making demands which should be met in terms of acquisition of civil rights and justice for her son. And she insisted on, for example, for opening the casket when he was funeralized in Chicago, which was quite an experience for one to have, to see him lying in the casket and showing the evidences of his having been killed.
And before we began this interview, you and I were talking about Clarence Norris, one of the Scottsboro boys. Tell that story once again, how you came to know him.
Our office moved to 1790 Broadway off Columbus Circle. And one day this man came into the office, and the switchboard operator called me to say we have a man here who needs help, which is often that happened. And usually at that point I was, I think, executive assistant to the Roy Wilkins, or assistant director between Mr. Wilkins and Dr. Morcell. And so I went out to see this man, and it developed his name was Clarence Norris. And
Did you recognize him?
I'm sorry?
Did you recognize him?
Not at first, but then after he started talking, I realized that I had seen his pictures and that he was one of the Scottsboro boys. And he said,
And he was a fugitive, was he not?
yes, he was. He had been for several years.
Right.
So this was not new. I mean, we knew this in the NAACP,
Right.
that he had escaped.
But you
and
didn't
that
know where he was and didn't know he'd walk into the office, did you?
didn't know, have the faintest
Yeah.
idea he was in the New York area.
Yeah.
And this had to be, I guess, in the late 60s when this happened. And he said, I went to the old office years ago, meaning 20 West 40th Street, and I met a Miss, the lady who was the office manager, and he described her. I said, Miss Branch? And he said, yes. And he said, if she's here, she'll help me. And I said, you need help? And he said, yes. So I called Bobby Branch and asked her if I could bring him around to her, and she said yes. And she remembered him, and our Branch, our office manager then, as you might recall, Bobby Branch, embraced people, and she was very, very gregarious, and she welcomed him and said, I'll help you. What do you need? And he needed some money, of course. And he said his wife, I believe, that first time, I think his wife was ill. She said, well, let me see if Mr. Wilkins is here, and I'll take you over to meet him. And I told her he wasn't there, but Dr. Morcell was. So he met Dr. Morcell, and they talked. And Dr. Morcell was a very thoughtful. If we can't provide some further assistance. And Willie Norris said that, yes, I need assistance. I want to clear my name before I die. And that's how this relationship again with him was resumed after the NAACP many years ago had been instrumental in helping them until a political problem arose where the Communist Party became involved and the NAACP stepped aside. That was when he was a much younger man,
Right.
shortly after their having been arrested for the rape to begin with.
And he had escaped and came to New York City, and now he's coming to the NAACP and making a request for an assistance for a pardon. And how did that
Well,
follow
actually,
through?
for money, it was his
For money
first request.
Yes, right.
And then he made, when he met and talked with John Morcell, he said Morcell said, we want to see how we can provide some meaningful assistance for you, meaning to try to get him settled into a
Right.
job and whatever. And he says, I want to clear my name. And they said, I want to clear my name before I die. And that's really when our general counsel, not that visit, but it was arranged to give him some money and for him to return. And when he returned, it was then he talked with our general counsel. Mr. Wilkins had spoken to Nathaniel Jones, who was our general counsel at that point, and asked if you would join Wilkins when Mr. Norris came back into the office. And from that point on, Nathaniel Jones became the person who was exploring how the our legal department could help him. And he assigned one of the bright young attorneys, whose name was James Meyerson, to work on the issue of getting a full pardon for Willie Norris.
And eventually Meyerson and Wilkins and Jones and Norris go to Alabama and secure his pardon.
Meet the governor and the attorney general and get a full pardon from them for Willie.
That's a wonderful, wonderful story.
Following that, the book was written, The Last of the Scottsboro Boys.
Many young people became involved in the NAACP through Youth Council. For a time, you worked as field secretary and director of education. What were your goals for the programs that involved young people?
Well, first, I should say I was never director of education. June Shagaloff was. I was director of a lot of things. I can't remember all of the jobs I had. Every 5 years, I would transfer to a new job. I was an assistant director to the executive, and then a director, and then finally director of operations and director of programs, under which education fell at that point. And I'm sorry, I forgot the other part of the question.
What were the goals that you worked on that involved young people? What were the programs that you worked on that involved young people?
Well, the programs which involved young people on which I worked early on were ACSO, which is the Academic, Cultural, Scientific Olympics, and they subsequently added Afro to the title. And that was for the purpose of developing academic excellence and general achievement as far as youth were concerned. It could be in any field, any of 24 fields, arts and science and literary in general. And the youth were organized on a local level according to the program. Now, this program was founded by Benjamin Hooks and Vernon Jarrett, who was a newspaper reporter from Chicago, and Benjamin Hooks became the successor to Roy Wilkins. And we organized units across the country, similar to youth units, with an advisor for ACSO, and the idea was to recruit those who showed promise locally, and then have local competitions, then regional competitions, then national competitions. And the program is still going strong today. There are some 600 ACSO units across the country which are actively engaged. The one here in metropolitan New York is where we are at the moment, is the largest one, because there are some 17 units ranches who participate.
And if you count the local branch participation, this is probably the largest African American talent-based scholarship program in the country.
Yes, and the most enduring.
Yeah.
And of course, scholarships are given, awards are given, medals are given at the national convention. And we have had such people, as I was trying to think of some people who have come through the ACSO program. I think there's a young man who's a conductor of a symphony who appears at Lincoln Center, who was an ACSO graduate. And we have others. I don't want to try to name names because I'll leave out some who
No, but they're a distinguished group of
yes.
achievers.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
A moment ago, you talked about the Roy Wilkins succeeding Walter White. Walter White died.
Yes, he did.
And Roy Wilkins was named to succeed him. Was there any, do you remember any discussion whether or not Roy Wilkins should have succeeded him, or was there another candidate, or?
No, not at that time, because Walter White died in 1955. Suddenly, he had been ill and on leave, but Roy Wilkins had been serving he had a leave of absence, Walter White did,
right.
And Roy Wilkins had been serving as administrator. And in his absence, he took over the duties of executive secretary. And when Walter White died while on leave, Roy Wilkins, after the funeral, of course, at the next board meeting, I believe it was, in the spring board meeting, was named as his successor. There had been some earlier discussions prior to this, when Walter White had gone on leave, had a leave of absence before. He went around the world, I believe, a few years before that. And there was some discussion then about whether Roy Wilkins would be his successor.
And succeeding Roy Wilkins was Benjamin Hooks.
Yes.
Describe him.
He was a Baptist minister and a dramatic Baptist minister. His oratorical skills were great, and he enjoyed demonstrating as he spoke. He inspired our constituents, whereas while Roy Wilkins was an intellectual type speaker who laid the facts out in elegant prose, Mr. Hooks demonstrated his speeches frequently by his physical activities at the podium, and he used the, shall I say, the gospel approach in terms of inspiring our constituents. And he was effective. He got the kind of visceral response which people enjoy during the course of speeches, and he could inspire them also, not just to respond to him, but to become actively engaged in the work of the NAACP. He kept our constituents committed in the units across the country. He tried to travel as much as he could. Because they are the connection between the national office and the constituents. If they aren't actively engaged in the 50 states across the country, then the NAACP's presence is not being brought to the fore as it should be, and to show how forceful it can be. And it is the only organization of its kind which has, shall I say, 1,700 units in the 50 states, plus some 500 youth and college units.
Why do you think it is that the NAACP's accomplishments and achievements are not as well known as one would think they'd be? After all, the organization's 100 years old plus, and has a remarkable record of achievement and accomplishment, yet it doesn't seem to be as well known as one would think it would be. Why do you think that is?
I have no idea, except that we as a people don't focus on history and our heritage. And the NAACP was here before most of all of us were here at this point. But as it has achieved many accomplishments, and actually it has affected the order of life for all of us, whatever color we are. What is more far-reaching than the interstate travel bill, for example, the school integration, desegregation of the public schools, or the public accommodations laws, where everybody could get access to places to which they, but what happens, I believe, is we forget our history. We live in the period, and then we take for granted what there is, and do not retain it as an achievement which had been caused by the hard work of those who came on before us. We don't really, as a people in this country, not just black people, but we don't really focus on our own American history and what has happened at the various periods and the transitions through which we have gone. We forget. And then take for granted, this is my right, it's here now. We don't think about how it was in the past. And the NAACP has been actually forgotten a lot of times when it was the only instrument which was able to achieve certain things which we now enjoy. And I don't have an answer.
Well, I don't either. Let me mention some organizations, some of which have come and gone in the span of the NAACP's history, and just give me your impressions of them. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference.
SLC?
SCLC.
My impression? Well, I think the SCLC was an effective organization in the sense that it brought to the fore in the minds of the public that the religious leaders in this country were engaged in and active in terms of passing the word of our civil rights and providing inspiration and leadership to their congregations throughout the country, that we should be mindful and become engaged in this struggle, and we can do by showing ourselves and lending our voices. SCLC was flexible because its leaders could go from one community to the other and call together the religious leaders in a given community to provide a voice for a particular cause and a particular action. And I think it was helpful in that respect in terms of setting before us actively through the pulpits what it was we needed to do and what we must do.
What about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, my old organization, SNCC?
Oh, yes. Well, you know more about that than I do. I certainly think that the sit-ins were extraordinary in the sense that they opened the eyes of the old folks, the adults in the country. Well, this I can do also. And a simple act of walking into a cafe or a 10-cent store, as they had then, lunch counter, and sitting there and saying, I'm not going to move. That's something all of us could do. But the students demonstrated that this is something that had not been done and that we're going to do it. And they did. And it was impressive, and it inspired us as older people to really go out and demonstrate and say, if our youth can do it, our children can do it, then why won't we do it?
What about the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE?
CORE was a little more intellectual, and it had an excellent leader in James Farmer, who formerly worked for the NAACP as our program director. So many of these leaders, by the way, of the other organizations had gotten their grounding and their foundations in the NAACP, such as Martin Luther King did, Jr., and his father had been active in the NAACP before him. So the CORE was more integrated than the other groups were in terms of racial integration, and it appealed to a younger group in general, students and young adults, and they were concerned about demonstrating in black and white the goals, the acquisition of the goals they wanted to achieve. And they had certainly an impact, I believe CORE did, in terms of encouraging non-blacks to participate actively in the civil rights movement.
What about the Black Panther Party?
Well, the Black Panther Party, I believe, had the energy and the ambition and a sense, in my judgment, of misdirection eventually. It started as a militant group wanting to use its power and apply it actively. Then it veered toward separation and separatism. Black Power became an instrument, in my judgment, to, shall I say, encourage and focus on black separatism, which I believe and am convinced was then self-defeating and would be today.
Back to the NAACP for a moment. I think many people think of the NAACP primarily as a legal organization, as an organization that achieved change through legal means, through the courts. Do you think this fairly characterizes the NAACP?
No.
Why not?
Well, one of the first executive orders that President Roosevelt, not one of the first ones, but an executive order that President Roosevelt issued about the armed services, the preliminary one, was done as a result of the NAACP's lobbying and campaigning, and the fact that Mrs. Roosevelt was on our board of directors. Walter White and Mrs. Roosevelt had a good relationship, and it was possible to get Mrs. Roosevelt to work with Walter White and Philip Randolph and get the president, then Roosevelt, to understand that an executive order desegregating federal installations should be issued. And of course, that wasn't integration, but it was a first step, and that was done without any legal action. And the civil rights law, the first civil rights law, was achieved primarily through lobbying and through under the aegis of Clarence Mitchell's the Washington Bureau. Again, that historic act was passed by Congress as a result of lobbying, which was within the confines of legality, but it wasn't a legal act. So I think, and the public accommodations law, the same thing. So there are so many things which widely affect our society, which the NAACP inspired, led, and accomplished, which were not legal actions, as such actions as far as litigation is concerned.
But again, this may be redundant. Why is it that we still think of, or many people think of, the NAACP as primarily a legal organization, and these other activities that you've mentioned aren't associated in the public mind with the NAACP?
I suspect one of the reasons is our lawyers appeared before the Supreme Court so many times. Former General Counsel Robert Carter had made some 36 appearances before the Supreme Court and won about 30 of those cases. And before that, Thurgood Marshall, before he became a justice when he was NAACP counsel, appeared before the Supreme Court. I can't remember the exact number now, but it was more than 24 times. And of course, most of those cases were won. And this, of course, the press, the publicity of the winning of these cases set in the minds of people that legal action was responsible or is responsible for our progress in this country, and to an important extent it is. But without the grassroots lobbying and without the work, the meticulous work of putting before our congressmen, both on local, state and federal levels, the need to enact certain laws and the pressure from the grassroots, we would not be where we were today, where we are today.
Skipping to another personality, do you think Malcolm X had any effect during his life on the NAACP or civil rights generally speaking? And did his death or his murder have an impact on the NAACP, particularly in northern cities, northern communities?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is one person's opinion.
Okay.
I think certainly he demonstrated the fact that discipline could be achieved in leadership. And he exercised discipline in the sense of the followers who became committed to his movement, the movement which he led, believed and committed themselves to conforming to the guidelines and expectations. And these were, in so many instances, young men who had been street people, who had no commitment as such except to survive the best way they could for themselves. And they became a part of a cohesive group and interacting with each other and willing to help each other and then project this onto the community. I think that's one excellent cause he served. And I believe that his death did have a serious impact because of the fact that it represented the death of a leader who had a following over whom he had, shall I say, such vast experience that they could be effectively band together to achieve progress by folks who have been formerly on the streets and who have formerly not been engaged in any meaningful activity. And this is important, was an important example, it seems to me, for those of us in civil rights. Not that we agreed with all of his philosophy.
But do you think you could feel a measurable impact that he had, particularly after his death, that there were people who within the NAACP perhaps, who said perhaps in some ways we should emulate his dedication, his conviction?
Yeah, there were. I think there were some people like that. Well, measurably there were, especially among our youth. They felt that he had the right idea in terms of his discipline and his rhetoric, which became more bland before he died than it was when he began, when he was preaching almost anarchy at one point in time, and he modified his position to develop pressure on the what he called the power structure by threatening and also showing that he represented a force in the community, in the society, I should say, not just the community. So I think that this impressed especially our younger adults and youth in the NAACP. You had a reaction that they believed that he was on the right track, or he's a good example for us to follow.
You were married to an attorney who worked with the NAACP to effect change. How did his work construct your lives together?
Well, before I knew him, John, he was chairman of the Legal Redress Committee of Detroit branch, having been born in Michigan and reared in Michigan. And when I first went to Detroit to work with the NAACP branch there, and Arthur Johnson, its executive secretary, we were organizing the first Freedom Fund Life Membership Dinner. And at that point, the Legal Redress Committee of the Detroit branch was very active, and they had won 2 or 3 cases in the Michigan, before the Michigan Supreme Court, involving housing and education. And John was the lead lawyer in those cases, in those particular cases. And it was after then that I got to know him. So that I always felt that the Detroit branch was an excellent example of the kind of activities and accomplishments that an NAACP branch should undertake. And of course, the work of the legal committee actually got commendations from the national office from Thurgood Marshall, who was then our general counsel. So that kind of thing impressed me about the importance of having a varied scope of activity in the civil rights movement. And of course, he, on the other hand, was supportive of the Detroit branch's other activities. So we were, shall I say, compatible in the sense, and we share an interest in terms of civil rights. That wasn't the reason we married, but that was one of the reasons of the common interest, in the early days.
Well, think about the Detroit branch. From your perspective and what you've seen over the years, what is it that makes Branch A effective, efficient, hard fighting, and so on, and Branch B lackluster, sleepy, do nothing?
It's leadership. I believe it's the leadership. The extent to which the leadership inspires the board and the members will be the extent to which they respond and become creative and are inspired to become creative and do things in a more positive and forceful nature. I think the key is in the kind of leadership our branches have across the country.
Let me ask you to talk about some occasions in the past, over time, when the leadership of the NAACP has faced real challenges or difficult circumstances. I'm thinking about the barring of the NAACP in Alabama, the lawsuit against the NAACP in Mississippi because of the boycott. Talk about those things. How did the people here respond to that?
When you say here, are you talking
New York, in the New York office.
About the national office?
National office.
Well, they were first of all, they were defiant, one. We are not going to give those membership lists up. That was the first thing. Second, we've got to find a way to work around this and continue our work. So we had employed recently Mrs. Ruby Hurley, who was sent to Alabama to organize units of the NAACP in the southeast region, which is the Confederate States. And Mrs. Hurley had been in Alabama not too long, I guess probably less than a year, doing this and organizing units headquartered in Birmingham, as I recall. She moved after the NAACP was banned. The office there was moved to Atlanta, but as a result of that, she and some other NAACP volunteer workers would visit these states in which the NAACP had been banned, Alabama, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, not Georgia, but Alabama, and I forget the other state. There were two states whose membership rolls were taken, would not be given up, I should say. In any case, the thing I wanted to say is Mrs. Hurley and other volunteers went almost surreptitiously into communities to work, get memberships for the NAACP and to organize certain things like getting petitions signed and to get them to get organized to go to the polls, to register, to go to the courthouse or wherever to register and vote. But it was done under the cover of night, so to speak, without the banner of the NAACP in the daytime having these meetings. And it made it shall I say, dangerous. Mrs. Hurley was threatened many times. Her life was threatened, and she was in danger doing this. But she was a spokesperson who was able to get these groups in these various states, in Alabama and Georgia and Mississippi, to come together to agree to do certain things in terms of continuing the fight for civil rights in their communities.
And what about when the local leadership would be under attack, as in the case of Medgar Evers' assassination? What was the New York headquarters office response?
Well, its response was to send people into Mississippi to fill the void, actually to reassure the people that the NAACP was continuing its fight. With Medgar's death, this was just even more important that we demonstrate that we were not intimidated by the fact that he was killed. So actually, his brother took over the position of field director for the state of Mississippi. And he's still there in Mississippi. Eventually became mayor of Philadelphia, I believe it was, Charles.
Yeah.
But this is the kind of thing the NAACP was forced to do in order to make sure that the people, its constituents, had examples of our continuing the work of the association one way or the other.
And what was Medgar Evers like? You surely knew him.
Yes, I worked with Medgar. I was sent to Mississippi in the 60s to interview farmers who had been denied credit because of, who was subjected to economic reprisals because of their NAACP activities, continuing to go to the polls to register and vote. And Medgar and I, as a field director, he would drive to the various places because this is the best way to get there. And we went into the Delta area to interview the farmers so I could take these reports back to New York to see how we could help them to survive the winter. And being denied credit over the winter season, it meant they had no means of getting food because that was the tradition. You get credit for the next 4 months, and then when the spring came, you were able to start planting, and you would be able to start paying the bills again, and all of that credit was cut off. So we traveled. I guess we spent at that point about 2 weeks doing this at one particularly difficult time when our farmers were being subjected to economic reprisals. We had 2 branch presidents who had been killed just before this particular time, and it was not. It was difficult to believe that these people would continue to carry on like this because the situation was so oppressive in Mississippi. And we were driving one night, and I had taken off my shoes, and I felt something on the floor, which was cold, and I said to Edgar, "What is this? Maybe I can move it." He said, "Well, that's my shotgun you have your feet on." So of course my feet flew up. But this is just to give you an idea of the sense of the environment. And we would drive each night from wherever we went, we're at Yazoo or whatever town, into which we'd gone at night, again, not to further endanger the farmers and the people who were being subjected to these reprisals, and drive back to Mound Bayou, which is a black town in that area in which there was a motel. And we would go back to stay at that motel and then start out the next day and planning to arrive in the sort of the evening to visit the farmers. And this is the way in which you had to function in those days out of Jackson, where you were, walked around in the daytime and did your interviews. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does.
Pardon me, before you move on to the next one.
Okay.
We've got an hour, so I need to start a new tape.
Okay.
So, hold on. And do either of you want a glass of water or anything? Can we get something for you?
No, but I could go to the bathroom.
Okay.
What a memory. I remember what I did yesterday.
That's,
About them on first meeting.
Well, I've really met them first at a meeting. Mrs. Bates would plan to have them gather, not necessarily an NAACP meeting as such, but just to meet with them, to talk with them, and I would say to inspire them and to sort of inject discipline to keep them together, in other words. And they were individual personalities. I did not get to know them well. I only knew them as a group in the course of the meetings because they were carefully tended in the sense of for their own security. This is before the year before Civil Central High School began the actual process of integration. This is I forget the year, but it was 55 or 56. Yeah. And then they actually entered the next year in the fall. But the thing that impressed me was the quiet determination of Ernest Green. I remembered him, who later became a member of the NAACP Board of Directors. Yes. And another one who I remember is Minnie Jean Brown, right, who had a special assertive personality.
Yes, she did. And
some of them were quiet, and others they were sort of followers in this sense. Mm-hmm. I'm sure they had their own individual personalities outside of the group, but those are the ones I remember most particularly as being responsive and actively ready to go forward with the process of going to school, and the others were I wouldn't say they were followers. I would just say that they were engaged in a quieter fashion, and they were less vociferous or less active in the process, except that they wanted to finish their schooling. They all had that.
What about?
hold on one moment. I just have one thing I want to. Okay, we can continue. Thank you.
Okay. Let me ask you about two women from South Carolina whom you may have met, Septima Clark and Bernice Robinson. Were cousins, I believe.
I met them, but I didn't really know them, except by reputation that they were very active and engaged. But I really didn't know them.
What about Ella Baker, who worked at the NAACP?
Yes, after she worked for the NAACP is when I met her, because she was a very forceful personality, and she became focused on our youth, if you recall, and actually was involved in the founding of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
Absolutely, yeah.
She worked in our Department of Branches before I came on board to the NAACP, and she spent considerable time traveling around the country organizing branches and eliciting memberships and developing membership campaigns and instructing our branches how to do that. And she was a very forceful woman, and I was always impressed by her determination and her aggressiveness. And at that time, at the time when I first started work for the NAACP, you didn't have that many women who were working in levels up beyond the support levels in the in the work arena, period, in other organizations as well. Most of the females were assistants or secretaries or that type of thing in the NAACP, and they had a few, for example, Lucille Black, who came in at age 17 as a secretary, and she worked her way up to become membership secretary, it was called then, of the NAACP. And Bobby Branch, who came in as a clerk, who wound up as office manager. Obviously, we hired certain NAACP in the legal department. There were always one or two females. And then when I came on board, one of the few female executives was June Shagaloff, who was a field director in education, who traveled to and worked providing information and support for the legal department and our legal programs.
And not a woman, but Jack Greenberg. What do you remember about Jack Greenberg?
Well, he was a young lawyer who came on. He was on board about a year before I came on. I got to know him quite well, and very active. And we were contemporaries in terms of age also. We were about the same age. And he worked well with Thurgood Marshall. He was a good, I believe they were called either associate or assistant counsels during that period, the young lawyers who were brought in. And he was focusing a lot on the education cases. That was one of the things that Jack focused on during the period when they were putting together cases in the various communities, about 6 or 8 communities around, primarily in the South or as far north as Kansas or west as Kansas, which eventually became the group of cases led by Brown to go up through the process on to the Supreme Court.
And Bob Carter. Robert Carter, what do you remember of him in those days?
Oh, yes. Well, Bob was the associate, I guess. He was a second attorney to Thurgood, who was still NAACP counsel at this point when I came on board, and remained so for the next few years. And Bob was the quieter one, but he also was the one who reached out in the communities and spent a lot of time and effort putting together the South Carolina cases, for example. And he eventually pled in a couple of instances during those trials before the Supreme Court. But he has a wonderful mind, and he was meticulous and concerned about amassing the information in an orderly way, and he spent a lot of times questioning it and really you got the feeling that he was being too meticulous or difficult, but it wasn't at all. He had this commitment to make sure that nothing was left unturned and no I was not dotted, and as a result, it became sort of laborious at times, the work for the people who were working with him, that is the assistants and the researchers. But it was, in the final analysis, it was what had to be done. It was not easy, but he was willing to put himself into the task of getting this part of the work done.
Do you want to stop that Can you hear the talking down there?
Yeah, I can hear it. Alright, okay, camera's rolling.
Okay.
You ready?
A moment ago, you mentioned that when you began working here at the NAACP, the employment sort of paralleled what we saw in the larger society, that is, women largely in clerical roles and men in the executive roles. Over time, I guess that's changed, but it also strikes me that it contrasts with a different picture in the branch system. In the branch system, women are presidents. Women do serve in roles that maybe they weren't expected to serve in. But how has this situation changed over time?
You mean in terms of the
Of women in the NAACP?
Well, actually, when you think about women's contributions to the NAACP, without the women, we wouldn't have an NAACP.
Right.
The person who was responsible for generating the organizing meeting was a woman. And of course, ever since then, we have had women in key roles, not in the majority, but in the very key roles which were responsible for the evolution of the NAACP. I think in terms of people like Mrs. Daisy Lampkin, who was a member of our national board from Pittsburgh, who traveled around the country garnering memberships and helping to organize branches. And that was back in the 30s and 40s. Before it became fashionable or popular for women to travel. You have women who have subsequently held positions in the NAACP nationally as program directors and as leaders of various divisions. And for example, Althea Simmons actually succeeded Clarence Mitchell as head of the Washington Bureau. We had Constance Baker Modley in the legal department, who eventually moved up to the leadership role in the Legal Defense Fund, NAACP Legal Defense Fund subsequently. You had Mrs. Frances Hooks, who founded, women had no defined place in the organization, and Mrs. Frances Hooks, the wife of Benjamin Hooks, founded Women in the NAACP, which gave them a structure in which to function and reach out and do the things in the NAACP that they had been doing, but in an organized and recognizable fashion. You wound up having Margaret Bush Wilson become the second female to be chairman of the board of the NAACP. And then the vice chair has developed, Rosalind Brock, who has succeeded you as chair. Women have been, and as a matter of fact, I don't know if you know this in your research of the NAACP, but the march, the 1919 march in New York here, in protest to Lynching, the silent march, the research in Arkansas and of the lynchings and then on into Georgia was done by a female who brought the report back for Dr. Du Bois, who was involved at that point in terms of amassing the information, which was the basis on which that march was constructed and held. As a result of that report, she brought back in 1918, and the march subsequently was held in 1919 after the information on the lynching and the murders that she had investigated was submitted really through our Washington Bureau to the federal government. It was felt that nothing would be done, so this march evolved. And of course, Dr. Du Bois was given the greater publicity for having, been the leader, but actually the responsibility of putting that together and causing it to happen was a report done by a female.
Did you have any interaction with Dr. Du Bois?
No, he was
gone,
even before my time.
Right, yes. But I mean, do you ever run into him? You both live in New York. I know it's a big city.
I met him, but and had written him for a copy of one of his documents, one of his papers, and he wrote back saying he'd be delighted to send it, to send $5. So I sent the $5 and got the paper.
All right.
But he was an interesting, I gather, from those who knew him in our office, they would relate stories about Dr. Du Bois and how acerbic he could be, and
Can you share a story?
well, I don't remember them well enough to tell, so I won't undertake to do that and mislead the history.
What would you like the public to know about the work you've done here at the NAACP?
Well, not really. I'm not really. I never thought about the public knowing much about what I do. My concern, as far as my being a part of the NAACP, was to do what I could in my small way to make its leaders, and that's my
But
satisfaction.
I'm sure your parents told you, don't hide your light under a bushel. And
They
there must
sure
be
did.
something here that you done here that you are proud of, among other things. Among all the things you've done here, there must be things that stand out, something that you're happy that you did.
I'd have to give some thought to that. I can't. I've had to do a lot of different things over the years. I wound up getting into that position where it was felt that I was flexible and I could fit into a lot of different places doing a lot of different jobs. For example, the reason I'm still probably at the NAACP, in one sense, I worked as a full-time person till 1997, was every 5 years I moved into a different department, a different job. And I have held, probably about 8 or 10 jobs in almost every department in the association except its accounting department. I can't count. But and the satisfaction I got was, one, learning how the NAACP functioned and how I could make it more effectively function in that particular area. For example, I went from the branch department as an assistant to Gloucester Curran and a field secretary at large. Now, that was my baptism. If you traveled in the early 50s, and as a female, a young, unattached, I wasn't married then, female, it was quite an experience. First, you had to be sure that in the cities where you went and the meetings and whatever, that you were properly on your guard in terms of the male-female interaction.
Right.
And then you had to be concerned about the branch president, who was an authority, but you were a young female. So if you had that as a thing, traveling in those days. It's no issue in later years, but it was unusual, apparently, for young, unattached women to travel into the highway, in all the kinds of byways I travel. So that was an education. I thank the NAACP for educating me, giving me the experience of being educated. But each time you had to be careful. You had to learn diplomacy. You had to learn self-protection, and you had to do your job. Now, all of that was combined in the process when I started work for the NAACP. And I won't go into all the departments, but I worked in virtually every department. And for me, it was always a good feeling when they said to me, well, you've done the basic organizing in the line membership department. Now, we need you as an executive assistant to the executive secretary. So we would like to get you to move into the executive department.
What was the last skill you learned at your job?
And so I did, and I would then go from I was director of operations at one point, director of programs. I wound up being development director. With the money, with the education I got in the NAACP and the knowledge, I could use that for marketing. And then I, of course, wound up going to school, taking courses so that I would know the technical side of fundraising. And then you had to learn how to be, respect confidences. And I've learned an awful lot about the leaders of the association and, the executive directors primarily. and what makes them tick and how they do this, that, and the other, what they shouldn't do or what they did do and shouldn't have and whatever. But it was a part of the education in terms of understanding what the NAACP needed and what they needed as leaders. So it's hard for me to say to you, I'm most proud of this or that or the other. There's probably something I am most proud of, but I don't, I guess I'm proud that we were able to keep the parents inspired in Hoxie, to keep the children and walking the children to school every day and getting them. And that school board voluntarily desegregated its schools, but the parents needed support and help. So I got a sense of satisfaction of walking with these children, holding their hands, going to school with them. And then they are persevering so that they wound up not being forced out of the schools. So it's hard for me to pick an item like an accomplishment. I don't know what accomplishment I might have achieved that would be worth talking about in the sense of an event, because it would be cumulative to the fact that I've been able to serve, I think.
Well,
I'm not answering your question, I know.
that's okay. Let me ask one more. In Hoxie and in other places where you went traveling for the NAACP, were there times when you felt in fear of your life?
Afterwards, yes. You know, a funny thing about it is when you're in danger, and like Medgar and I were traveling around, and I didn't realize I had my feet on the shotgun there,
Right.
And being intimidated and going across fields, cotton fields and other fields at night to get to a local meeting which was being held, and the fact that there were police patrolling in the Delta area. My reaction of fear has come after I've gotten through it, because you don't have time to be afraid. I have found that after I said, "You are stupid. How could you get in such a situation out in the middle of nowhere and nobody on whom to call?" But the fear comes, as far as I can recall, after it has you've gotten out of that particular physical situation. And it does come, but later. I think if you're pushed to do something or have to do it, you're more focused on how can I get this done. That has been my experience. And my parents always had said to me, you're an idiot if you get afraid while you're doing something, because you become your own worst enemy, you know, and you act without logic or reason. And you don't want to do that. You want to plan and try to do what is most appropriate to safeguard yourself and reach that goal, whatever it is. But it's some things that I look at now, as I said, some of the travels in the 50s and going into, say, I spent a summer in Arkansas traveling to the various branches. Mm-hmm. And small branches like El Dorado, I think they call it, Arkansas, and Cotton Plant, Arkansas. Never heard of it until I went there. And places where the white citizens in the town, the power structure, the worst thing that they could learn was that a visitor from for the NAACP branch from New York was coming in to stir up trouble. And that was a kind of environment in which I worked, and so many instances during that, say it was 5-year period that I served as a field secretary. And I guess I must have worked in about 40 states, and some of them, you know, the West and North were not as intimidating as the South, but I traveled frequently in Mississippi, also in Georgia, also Alabama, and those states were where the tensions were greatest and the people were most fearful, including the local units were exceedingly careful. And that was a learning experience for me about people and how you could survive and accommodate yourself to staying in their homes and feeling that you were bringing them danger, because the fact that I was there sleeping in their room, and there's nothing secret. Eventually, the town knows what the folks are doing. So those experiences have, I think, made me maybe more humane today, and made me understand that people are imperfect, but they are worth any help you can give to ameliorate the problems and negative problems. And I think the NAACP has had that kind of an effect in communities where it has functioned as an entity. People have felt that they could get help going to the NAACP, that there would be something done in their behalf. I think they believed that, and I believe in large measure they still do. And we, on the other hand, should be accountable and responsible, and our leaders should be effective in the sense that they should be able to reach out to people and inspire their confidence about what they do as an example. And any help you can give to make that happen should be given.
Well,
I still haven't answered your question,
that's
have I?
okay. That's okay. Thank you for giving your help. Thank you. I think we're through.
This video raises questions, and I need you to be extremely honest in the comments when answering them. And just so you know, I have 3 questions. Number 1, are you afraid of change? Number 2, what good have you put into the world? And number 3, what experience made you a better person? Now please be honest when answering these questions. Share this video with anyone you deem necessary. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.